Welcome to I Could Talk to You All Day. I'm Lauren Lefkowitz, recovering workaholic, perfectionist, and people pleaser.
And I'm John Spears, emerging from playing small, getting caught up in the inertia of life, and always being on.
I Could Talk to You All Day is a show for executives and emerging leaders. This is not just another leadership podcast. We're here to talk about what it means to be a leader while also being human.
So join us for raw, vulnerable, and probably pretty funny conversations about shifting from surviving at work and home to thriving in the life you've always wanted. Let's get the conversation started.
Hey, John.
Hey, Lauren. How are you doing today?
I am awesome. We are spending the next several episodes talking about executive presence in a whole bunch of different ways. And this topic today is one of my favorites. And I feel like we're saying that every show. This is my favorite topic. But today we're talking about vulnerability. And it's my favorite because it was the hardest thing for me to come around to.
Yeah.
I like to be perfect. I don't know if you know that about me. Do you know that about me?
I know that about you. Yeah, it's pretty clear.
Yeah. I'm keep learning over and over that perfection is not real. And I keep learning over and over that not only is perfection not attainable, but it's boring. It doesn't make any sense. And so here we are, two vulnerable people talking about why vulnerability is even in the executive presence conversation.
Yeah, I am so excited about this conversation. One, because as you know, I've been railing against looking at executive presence only in the view of how we act, how we look, how we speak. I think there's so much more that we should be looking at, particularly what's happening on the inside of leaders, what happens underneath all of that. And so to be able to shift gears from our last episode where we talked about what's wrong with focusing on solely those external manifestations of executive presence to actually thinking about what are those qualities of incredible leaders and what can we do in our own lives to elevate our leadership. And I think vulnerability is one of those things that is the gateway to great leadership.
It's also the ickiest of the topics we're going to be talking about.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. I don't even know a better word than icky because it's touchy-feely. It's real mushy. And there are a lot of misconceptions about what vulnerability is. And there's a lot of resistance to vulnerability for a whole bunch of reasons.
But I think part of that ickiness is it's a soft skill. It's one of those things that it's not a hard skill. It's not something that you can usually put on your resume to say, check vulnerable. And I think as leaders, people really look to see that.
John, how would you even describe vulnerability?
So there are lots of definitions out there around vulnerability. I think vulnerability is about showing up fully. It's about being exposed. And there's this element of putting yourself out there in a way that makes you capable of being hurt, of exposing your feelings, your thoughts, your experiences in such a way as to share them with other people and maybe be afraid of what their reaction might be, but putting it out there anyway. As maybe a gift to the world and letting it just be that without fear of judgment.
For me, there were two words that you said pretty close to each other that really hit me in the heart, which is capability and vulnerability existing at the same time. We did an exercise, you and I, in a class where we talked about what made it difficult to be us. And two qualities that we didn't think could coexist. And mine ended up being capability and vulnerability. And I had this way of being that I was only willing to be vulnerable when there was very little risk and when it wouldn't make me look stupid, which isn't really vulnerability. It's just like sharing myself a little in a no risk situation. And what I've learned over time is that I can be capable. I can be very capable and also be vulnerable and get willing to be a beginner and say that I don't know things and ask for help. But it wasn't easy because of that definition of vulnerability, of opening yourself up, of letting yourself be at risk of being rejected or ridiculed or not trusted for your capability. I'm now leading us into my next question, which is, why are leaders so hesitant to be vulnerable?
Lauren, I think that's a great question. And I think there are probably, in my mind, three main reasons why leaders fear vulnerability. The first is, going back to our conversation around executive presence, is we're not taught to be vulnerable. No one has that conversation in business school or in leadership. It's all about the hard skills, again, the external manifestation of executive presence, how we act, how we speak, and how we look. And I don't think that leaders have, in the past, have had a good model of what it means to be a vulnerable leader. I think things are changing. I think obviously you have people out there who are talking about vulnerability in leadership. Thank you all for doing that. And so I think we're emerging with new role models around what it means to be a vulnerable leader. But I don't think that we've had good role models in the past. And it's always been frowned upon to show emotion at work, to be vulnerable, to express yourself in that way at work. And so I think that's shifting. And I think that's why so many leaders have a difficult time. I think the next is around a fear of being seen as weak or insufficient. When you say, I don't know, or I'm having a rough day because X, Y, and Z, there's a certain putting yourself out there and risk that others will not think you're up to the task, or that you are being too emotional or too vulnerable at work. I don't agree with that, obviously, but I think there are some people who think that. And the last, I think, is around leaders feeling insecure, that if I share this part of me, if I expose this part of me, that I'm letting people in to see the real me. And maybe that's not good enough.
For sure, everything you just said. And my sort of three keywords in this are weakness, stupidity, and incapability. Not even sure that that's a word on its own, but that's the direction I was going. You and I have that same view of, we think we're going to look weak. There's that insecurity that we think if we ask questions, if we say, I don't know, if we say, I'm overwhelmed, this is too much, that we will look like we can't handle things, like we're weak.
Yeah.
And then there's this fear of, I should know this. So if I'm asking questions, I'm going to look like an idiot. People are going to think I'm so dumb. And then they're going to think I can't do the job. And what's so funny about this to me, not in a haha way, but in a strange way, is that when we see our own leaders not being vulnerable, making bad decisions, not asking for our input, all we want from them is vulnerability. But because we're not taught that it's okay to be vulnerable, because we're taught that confidence means knowing what you're doing, having all of the answers, making the tough decisions on your own, we are so afraid to be vulnerable, and we would rather have people think we're a jerk and we're making decisions without input than have people think we're dumb. So we hesitate. We don't want to take that risk of being seen as any kind of less than.
Lauren, I think you just said a word that is so important around vulnerability, and that's risk. I think being vulnerable means taking a risk. And oftentimes we're not willing to do that because we don't know what the outcome is.
And if we go back to an earlier episode about facts and stories and our own interpretations of how things go, vulnerability is at that fear point where we haven't finished the story yet. Mm-hmm. We haven't sorted through the facts. We just have this sort of feeling that if we get vulnerable, we're going to be punished for it. I lived in that kind of fear for a really long time, where the anxiety of what would happen if I took the risk to actually be myself, to actually say, I'm overwhelmed, I need to do less, I need to take something off my plate. I don't know the answer. I don't know how to do this. Any of those phrases coming out of my mouth felt so risky. And I created this story that nobody would pull me into the room for things anymore if I ever said I didn't know anything. And what I later learned was that people were waiting for me to ask for help.
Yeah.
But I didn't know that. So I created all of these stories about why I couldn't. So as we start thinking about all of these reasons to be hesitant and taking this risk, why bother? Like, what's the incentive to be vulnerable?
Lauren, I think one of the main reasons to be vulnerable is that we are all humans having a very human experience. And so the things that we're experiencing in life, the joys, the triumphs, the pain, the sorrow, those are experiences that everyone else is having. And I know sometimes it can feel as a leader that you're the only one having this experience, that no one understands that what you might be going in or what your experience might be. And I was there at a point in time. And then I think about the fact that there are almost, 8 billion people in the world. And surely one of those, someone else in the world is having a similar experience. It might not be the same as mine. They might not be feeling the same way, but they know, someone else knows exactly what I'm going through in their own experience. And so I think as leaders, showing up fully and taking that risk to be exposed is so important because, one, it helps our leadership, but it also gives other people access to their own vulnerability. It shows that they can be vulnerable in the workplace. And I think there are a number of studies and papers out there that talk about the benefit of vulnerability in the workplace, that it actually increases employee engagement, that it decreases turnover, that it is inspiring, that saying, I don't know, can you please help me, increases innovation and effectiveness. And so there's this long list of benefits to being vulnerable at work. And I think if more leaders took the risk to be vulnerable, we would have happier, more fulfilling and engaged colleagues and teams at our workplaces. That would then lead to a better work product.
I feel like this is a good time for us each to share a story about getting vulnerable and how it actually worked in our favor. So I know you've been at your company for some time, and you and I have talked about how you've transitioned from one way to another of being at work. And I'd love to hear about a situation that came up for you where you deliberately made a decision to be more vulnerable and how that worked out.
Yeah, there's one story that comes to mind, but I can certainly say in the last 5 years that I've been at my current organization, there's definitely been the shift from focusing on the external manifestation of executive presence, again, how I speak, how I look, how I act, to shifting to a more internalized inward view of what it means to be a leader and how I show up intentionally and authentically and in a vulnerable way. I would say one of the things that I'm really proud of myself for doing recently was posting on LinkedIn about my experience with my dad. And for those of you who know me, I've shared this kind of pretty frequently in personal one-on-one conversations, but I've never put it out there in the world in this way. And it was really scary. I was fearful of doing it because I was exposing myself. I was telling other people about an experience that I've gone through that doesn't make me feel great and that I have my own stories around, or rather I had my own stories around. And so I very publicly shared that my parents got divorced when I was 8, or rather they got divorced when I was 2. And when I was 8, my dad called me up and said, call me when you're 18. I don't want to deal with your mom anymore. And he stuck to that and he didn't call me. And when I was 20, I knocked on his door, said, hey, Dad, I'm your son, John. And we talked for 3 weeks. And then on Father's Day of the year 2000, I called him and his phone was disconnected and I never heard from him again. And I shared that story, I think it was recently on Father's Day, to give a shout out to all the kids out there that parented themselves, that fathered themselves when their parent or their dad wasn't there. And I put it out there because one, it was kind of shining a light on my own experience and kind of removing the shame around it that I had for myself. But I also did it because I knew other people in the world had that experience. And what was really remarkable was that a colleague emailed me and said, "Oh my God, John, we had basically the same experience. We had a very similar experience." And we then proceeded to talk about it. And it was really a really remarkable experience to be able to share that with a colleague, for me to bring my own pain and experience to a conversation, for him to do that, and for us to connect on that level. And I think when we're vulnerable, we give access to ourselves to other people. So there is, you want to be mindful about what you're sharing with people and what you're saying, but it really just created this bond that I now have with this colleague in this really remarkable way. And so that was a really intentional choice that I made. I thought about it. I was scared to do it, but I did it anyway, because I thought that it would not only benefit me and provide some healing for me, but it would also help someone else out there. And I'm just really glad that it helped someone that I work with on a day-to-day basis. And we were able to have that experience and share that together.
That's such a beautiful story for a bunch of reasons. First of all, that you felt brave enough to share it, that it helped you release some of the shame around it, some of the story in the story that spins around your head while you're carrying it with you, and that you made yourself so relatable to somebody else. And that was just one person who got back to you. The number of people who read that and resonated with it, I'm sure, was exponentially more.
Yeah.
And now people know you more. People know you on a deeper level. It builds trust. It builds compassion. And it's so powerful that you were able to share that and willing to share that.
Thanks, Lauren. I'm really curious about you. I'd love to hear a story from you about a time you were vulnerable.
When I got sick in my 30s, I hid it from everybody. And I talk about my chronic illness fairly frequently now, but it started when I had a grand mal seizure when I was 29. And it led to my body just breaking down and creating all of these autoimmune diseases. And I'm still living with it, living better than I've lived in many years. But I kept it a secret because of all of the reasons we talked about being hesitant to be vulnerable. I thought it would make me look weak. Nobody would trust me with work. They wouldn't want to put too much on my plate. So I just kept working. And when I moved to the last organization that I worked with, they were a disease state organization. So they worked with a population who was underserved and had a rare disease. And during my interview, I decided to tell them that I had my own chronic illnesses. And it was in the context of being so grateful to find an organization that worked with patients to fight a disease that nobody else was really paying attention to. And I said it in the context of, if I had had that when I was going through my own findings, my own investigations into my diagnosis, what a wonderful level of support that would have been. My heart was pounding when I said it, because I thought this might lose me the job. And instead, they thanked me for sharing it and told me how relatable it was for the population that they served. Mm-hmm. And then they let me work 80 to 100 hours a week. So nobody was worried I couldn't do the job. I don't know if that's a positive or a negative outcome, but it also gave me this freedom to walk into the organization as an employee and not be afraid to take a sick day, to say, I'm not feeling great today. I just need some quiet, to turn my office lights off if I had a migraine, and to just really be able to be my sometimes healthy, sometimes not healthy self. And it taught me that I didn't have to compartmentalize and hide this part of myself from the whole world. Mm-hmm. It gave me more freedom to talk about it. And it gave other people permission to come and tell me what they had going on and ask me for advice or support or an ear. And so it really changed how I became willing to share myself with other people. Yeah,
I love that story. And something you said made me think of some comments that we heard when we were live on LinkedIn the other day, is being real increases our ability to be relatable. And when we share parts of ourselves, other people see themselves in us, and it creates this bond, this community, this experience that other people feel seen in that. I think that's so powerful, particularly around leadership. And you tapped into something that we're going to talk about in a future episode, and that's around courage. This, when you had your heart was pounding, you were nervous, you're questioning, should I share that? Courage and bravery is another element of executive presence, and we're going to talk more about that. But I think that's so important to think about when we're being vulnerable, is that it's not always easy to be vulnerable. There are some obstacles that we have to overcome internally to be able to share ourselves, to be able to give ourselves the capacity to be seen by others.
So true. Now we're sort of on to like, what's the balance? How do you share? How much do you share? When do you decide to get vulnerable? And you said it during your story. When do you do it anyway? Even if you're scared, even if your heart is pounding, what's the balance of it all?
Well, that's a really good question. And I have absolutely no clue what the balance is. I think that's probably a really personal decision. I think it looks different for different people. I feel really comfortable being vulnerable. I shouldn't say that. I push myself to be vulnerable. It's not always comfortable. It's not always easy, but I want to live on the other side of that in my life. And so I've made a really conscious decision to push myself, to share of myself, and to be vulnerable on a regular basis. And so for me, that kind of experience is probably more frequent than someone who might be just starting out to be vulnerable.
I think that you're right, that balance is unique to each of us. I think the key is to really think about what you need. And what I mean by that is there are so many times that we just push through. We do things because we don't want to ask for help, because we're scared to ask for help, because we don't want to look insecure, weak, incapable, all of those things that we said before. But there's a balance between what we actually need in order to move forward and what we want to keep close to ourselves, what we want to not share. And the cool thing is we all get to decide what our threshold is and how vulnerable we're willing to be. I will say for me, the more vulnerable I get, the more capable I get.
Mm-hmm.
Because I get more capable to ask for help, learn something, and then incorporate that into what I already know. My biggest fear in being vulnerable, besides looking weak, besides looking stupid, was having people find out that I didn't know everything.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Which I guess is sort of the weak and stupid part. But I always wanted people to think I knew everything. I could answer any question. I could help you with any situation. I could solve any problem. It's what got me to be the vice president of whatever you need at work. And it was cool to be the person who could be the go-to for everything. What I also learned was it's also really cool to go to somebody who knows something I don't know and ask them to teach me. Mm-hmm. Or ask them to support me, or ask them to take it off my hands. Because first of all, it takes the pressure off of me. And secondly, it's actually an honor for other people to be able to serve.
It is, yeah.
So when I take all of this on and I show no vulnerability and I ask for no help, I'm also not asking for team. I'm not asking for collaboration. I'm not asking for relationships. I'm just like doling out stuff and panicking the whole time because I don't know everything, can't know everything. So the more vulnerable I get, the more I feel served, I feel whole, I feel in community, and the smarter I get because you can't just learn everything on your own. Right. You need other people. It's like that human interaction. Our lives are enriched by each other. And so we have to get vulnerable. We have to let people in order to grow. We're going to be talking about executive presence over the next several episodes. We've got a bunch of topics coming up. You talked about courage. We're going to talk about boundaries. We're going to talk about a whole bunch of different things related to executive presence. And clearly from our conversation, there is a benefit to leadership, to executive presence, to being vulnerable. So if somebody wants to take like a first step and dip their toe in the water of getting a little bit vulnerable, being a little bit more open,
I would give two pieces of advice. One is I would start small. I wouldn't maybe go and expose and share the deepest, darkest secret that I have. I would go sort of light, small at first. And the second piece of advice I would give folks is to do it scared. That, obviously we want to trust ourselves, we want to trust our intuition and trust when it is appropriate and not appropriate to share certain things. But I think doing it scared is probably the best piece of advice I have for any situation, not just for those that are seeking to be more vulnerable at work.
That's great advice. I would add to that, do it with a peer. I think getting vulnerable with a peer is the lowest risk way to get vulnerable. When you go to a manager, you've got all of this fear in your head about what they're going to think about you and what might change in your subordinate managerial relationship with them. If you do it with somebody who reports to you as a first step, you have this fear that they won't respect you or listen to you anymore or do what you're asking of them. None of that's true, by the way, but it is the story we make up. Find a trusted peer, go out for coffee, go out for lunch, tell them what's going on and what you need help with. And think about the thing that causes you the most stress right now at work that they might be able to give you some input on. That's where I'd start.
I love that. That's really good advice.
Thanks, John. As you know, I could talk to you all day about this.
All day long, every day.
All day long. But we're at the end of the show. So we're going to wrap up. Thank you so much for being with us in this conversation. It is always so interesting and so eye-opening and so much fun to have these conversations with you, John. So we'll see you next time when we talk about courage and how that applies to leadership and probably how it relates to vulnerability and executive presence. Thanks so much, everyone. We're so glad you joined us today. Make sure to follow us on Instagram at I Could Talk to You All Day and tell your friends about us.